On July 16th, 1945, at 5:29 in the morning, the New Mexico desert became the brightest point on Earth. The light was visible from 160 miles away. The shockwave shattered windows in towns that had no idea what was happening. The heat at the center of the explosion reached temperatures comparable to the surface of the sun. A man named Robert Oppenheimer watched from a bunker 10 miles away. When it was over, he thought of a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He did not say it with pride. He did not say it with regret. He said it the way a person speaks when they understand, fully, finally, and too late, what they have done. This is the story of how the most destructive weapon in human history was built, and of the brilliant, frightened, brilliant, conflicted human beings who built it. To understand what happened in the desert that morning, you have to go back 30 years, to the laboratories of Europe, where physicists were quietly dismantling everything humanity thought it knew about matter. In 1905, Albert Einstein published a paper containing a single equation, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light, squared. It meant that a tiny amount of matter, if converted entirely into energy, would release an almost incomprehensible amount of power. For decades, this remained theoretical, beautiful mathematics, nothing more. Then, in December 1938, in a laboratory in Berlin, two German chemists named Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann bombarded uranium atoms with neutrons and discovered that the uranium nucleus split in two. They called it fission. The energy released by a single fission event was minuscule. But if you could chain thousands of billions of fission events together, each split releasing neutrons that triggered more splits, the energy released would be extraordinary. The equation was no longer theoretical, it was a blueprint. And in Berlin, in 1938, with Adolf Hitler in power and a world war approaching, that blueprint was terrifying. The physicists who understood fission were, almost without exception, terrified. Many of them were Jewish scientists who had fled Europe from Germany, Hungary, Italy, Poland, carrying their knowledge across the Atlantic to universities in America. They had left behind everything. They knew what Nazi Germany was capable of. In the summer of 1939, a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard drafted a letter. He needed someone the American government would actually listen to. He drove to a small cottage on Long Island and asked the most famous scientist in the world to sign it. Albert Einstein signed the letter on August 2nd, 1939. It was addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It warned, in careful diplomatic language, that Germany might be working to build an atomic bomb and that the United States needed to act. Roosevelt read the letter 6 weeks later. He turned to an aide and said, "This requires action." What followed was the largest scientific undertaking in human history. At its peak, it employed over 130,000 people across 30 sites in the United States and Canada. It cost $2 billion, equivalent to roughly 30 billion today. Almost no one outside the project knew it existed. They called it the Manhattan Project. In 1942, the United States Army appointed a general named Leslie Groves to run the project. Groves was methodical, difficult, and brilliant at managing large operations. He needed a scientific director, someone who could lead a team of the most brilliant and most difficult personalities in science toward a single goal. He chose J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was not the obvious choice. He had no Nobel Prize, he had never run a large organization, he had known members of the Communist Party and was considered a potential security risk. Groves chose him anyway. Oppenheimer was 38 years old. He was thin, intense, chain-smoking, intellectually restless, a man who read Sanskrit for pleasure and could move between quantum physics and poetry without stopping to breathe. He had a gift that almost no one else possessed. He could understand the work of specialists across every discipline and synthesize it into a coherent whole. He also understood from the beginning exactly what he was building. In a letter to a colleague written before the project began, he described the potential destructive power of a fission weapon. He used the word terrible, not as criticism, as description. He went to work anyway, because he believed, as did almost everyone involved, that if America did not build it first, Germany would. In the spring of 1943, on a remote plateau in New Mexico, at 7,300 feet elevation, a city appeared from nothing. It had no name on any official map. Mail was addressed simply to P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe. The scientists who moved there, many bringing wives and children, were given false identities. Their real names did not appear on any document. Los Alamos was home to what may have been the single greatest concentration of scientific talent ever assembled. Enrico Fermi, who had already demonstrated the first nuclear chain reaction in a squash court under a stadium in Chicago. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who had founded modern atomic theory, smuggled out of occupied Denmark in a hollow bomb casing. Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, Edward Teller, names that defined 20th century physics. They worked 18-hour days. They argued constantly about physics, about ethics, about the nature of what they were doing. Feynman, then 25 years old and already brilliant, cracked the safes of senior colleagues for entertainment. Others spent evenings playing music, organizing lectures, debating philosophy. It was, by many accounts, the strangest and most extraordinary community that has ever existed. A city of geniuses, hidden in the desert, racing against a clock they could not see, building something they could barely imagine. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The original reason for the Manhattan Project, the fear of a German atomic bomb, no longer existed. Allied investigators entering Germany discovered that the Nazi nuclear program had barely progressed. Germany had never come close to building a weapon. At Los Alamos, some scientists stopped. They asked the question that had always been there, waiting. If the weapon was built to stop Hitler, and Hitler was gone, why were they still building it? A group of scientists, led by Szilard, drafted a petition to President Truman, arguing against using the bomb on Japan without warning. They gathered signatures. 68 scientists signed it. The petition never reached Truman. It was classified and filed away by military security. The work continued. They called the test Trinity. No one is entirely sure why Oppenheimer chose that name. He later suggested it came from a poem by John Donne. Others believed he simply wanted a name that carried weight. On the night of July 15, 1945, the scientists gathered at observation points across the desert. They were given welding goggles to protect their eyes. Some lay face down on the ground, facing away from the blast. Some stood and watched. Enrico Fermi characteristically decided to measure the yield of the explosion by dropping small pieces of paper from his hand at the moment of detonation and observing how far the shockwave moved them. At 5:29:45 a.m., the device detonated. The yield was equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, 3 times larger than the most optimistic predictions. The fireball reached a diameter of 600 meters in less than a second. The heat melted the desert sand beneath the tower into a glassy substance that did not exist before that morning. Scientists later named it Trinitite. General Rhodes turned to his deputy and said, "The war is over." His deputy replied, "Yes, after we drop 2 of these on Japan." Oppenheimer said nothing. He remembered the line from the Bhagavad Gita. He kept it to himself. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, a bomb nicknamed Little Boy was dropped over the city of Hiroshima, Japan. It detonated 600 meters above the city center. The immediate blast killed an estimated 70,000 people. By the end of 1945, the death toll from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries had risen to between 90,000 and 166,000. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Between 60,000 and 80,000 more people died. The majority were civilians. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The Second World War was over. Whether the bombings were a military necessity or a moral catastrophe, or both, remains one of the most debated questions in modern history. Historians, ethicists, and survivors have argued it for 80 years without resolution. What is not debated is what happened, what those numbers meant in human terms, what a city looks like when 70,000 people are erased from it in less than a second. The scientists returned from Los Alamos to universities, laboratories, and ordinary lives, but nothing was ordinary anymore. Oppenheimer became the most famous scientist in America, and one of the most tormented. He lobbied for international control of nuclear weapons. He opposed the development of the hydrogen bomb, which would be 1,000 times more powerful. In 1954, during the McCarthy era, his security clearance was revoked after a hearing that many considered a political prosecution. He spent the last years of his life in relative isolation, stripped of the influence he had used to build the very thing that destroyed him. Leo Szilard, who had drafted the letter to Roosevelt and the petition to Truman, spent the rest of his life working for nuclear arms control. He switched fields entirely, from physics to biology, as if he could no longer bear to work in the discipline that had produced the bomb. Albert Einstein, who had signed the letter that started it all, said later, "Had I known that the Germans would not succeed in developing an atomic bomb, I would have done nothing." And Enrico Fermi, who had built the first nuclear reactor, who had dropped pieces of paper in the desert to measure a weapons yield, died of stomach cancer in 1954. Some believed it was caused by years of radiation exposure. It was never confirmed. They had changed the world. They knew it. Most of them spent the rest of their lives trying to understand whether that was something to be proud of. Today, there are approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads in the world. 9 countries possess them. The combined destructive power of the global nuclear arsenal is estimated at 135,000 times the yield of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The desert in New Mexico, where Trinity was tested, is open to the public twice a year. People drive out and walk the ground. Some pick up pieces of trinitite, the green glass the explosion created, before being asked to put them back. The radiation is still measurable. It will be for centuries. Robert Oppenheimer's security clearance was officially reinstated in 2022, 68 years after it was revoked. The ceremony was attended by his surviving family. He had been dead for 55 years. What the Manhattan Project left behind is not only weapons, it is a question still open, still unanswered, about what science owes to the world it changes, about whether the pursuit of knowledge carries within it a responsibility for what that knowledge makes possible. The scientists who built the bomb were not monsters. They were brilliant, principled, frightened human beings who made a decision under extraordinary pressure and lived with the consequences for the rest of their lives. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing of all.